And today I'm excited to talk to you guys about Aboriginal research and how it relates to the justice system as well as positive psychology. So I'm going to try to cover some crim and psych for you guys. And as I mentioned to those of you that were here at the beginning, my background is more psych, just so you know. So this is just a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to be covering today. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a background in Aboriginal psychology and just Aboriginal issues in general. So first I just wanted to clarify what Aboriginal actually means, because often there will be some confusion as to what it includes. So currently, according to the Canadian government, Aboriginal is the current all-inclusive term used in Canada, kind of the politically correct term to be using. The international equivalent would be Indigenous peoples. So according to the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982, Aboriginal peoples refers to the original inhabitants of North America and their descendants. And the Constitution recognizes three distinct groups of Aboriginal peoples. So the first is First Nations, and that term came into common use around the 1970s, and it replaced the term Indian, which some people found to be offensive. So First Nations is essentially bands which are self-determined political and organizational units of the Aboriginal community. And First Nation bands are usually located on lands which are called reserves. The second group that the Constitution recognizes is the Métis peoples, and they're of mixed First Nation and European ancestry. And then the last group is Inuits, and generally they live in northern Canada and Alaska. So with each of these three groups, they have distinct heritages and cultures. Often people might make the mistake of thinking all Aboriginal people are the same, and that's definitely not the case. And in Canada, we have 1.4 million people that identify as being Aboriginal, and that amounts to about 4% of the population. So we have 45 Indigenous nations, and that just includes the First Nations people. And then in those different nations that build and make up Canada, there's 608 bands. And a band means that this community will have their own chief, their own council, their own land, their own community. So each nation is made up of multiple bands. And then Aboriginal peoples, to show the kind of diversity that exists, they have 23 languages. And if you count the unique dialects, there's actually 50. So there's a lot of diversity there. And Aboriginal peoples are the fastest growing demographic in Canada, and the majority of them are under the age of 25. And that's why us working in youth forensics, we see that as such an important population to focus on. And we'll talk about some other reasons why they're important for our department later. And then the majority of Aboriginals now live in cities. So often Aboriginals will leave the reserves to seek better opportunities to improve their lives through education or employment, because often on reserves there's just very limited options there. And also they'll leave reserves to escape abusive environments and memories, which we will be touching on next. Okay, so I thought to better understand Aboriginal psychology and issues, we really got to look at the history of what's happened to Aboriginal peoples throughout Canadian history. So I have a bit of a flow chart of sorts to sort of illustrate what's the history that's been occurring. So first there was colonization, and because of colonization, that actually led to forced assimilation through Canadian policies and laws. And then because of that assimilation, it then leads to cultural oppression. And we see here, there's some examples of the different kinds of things that, in terms of long-term effects that this cultural oppression brings. So we have the Aboriginal peoples being separated from their lands and being placed in reserves. We have things like their government and cultural practices being dismantled, and issues like women's rights are severely at risk with all this cultural oppression. So the biggest historical tragedy to face Aboriginals in Canada has been the residential schools. So over 150,000 children were forcibly removed from their families and communities to attend what was then called Indian residential schools. And the whole point of these residential schools was to make the assimilation process easier. So with the residential schools, they operated for 7 generations. So imagine your family and 7 generations being put into these schools. So it happened for a very long time. The last residential school closed its doors in 1996. So it's still in quite a recent history. And that last school closed in Saskatchewan. Most children that were in these schools, they were there for about 10 years. So pretty much the bulk of their childhood. The goals of the residential schools, there were 3 of them. So firstly, to assimilate Aboriginals into mainstream society. Second, to convert them to Christianity. So there you're seeing that they're losing their religion. And then third, they're learning English, so losing their language. And then because of some of the goals of the residential schools, like converting the children to Christianity, these the government contracted the residential school operations to churches. And then the children face many different forms of abuse in the schools. So it's called residential schools, but there was actually not very much good formal education going on in these schools. So in terms of actual education, they only taught curriculum equivalent to the grade 3 level. So when these survivors did end up leaving the schools, most of the time they couldn't read and write well enough to actually get jobs anyway. And the majority of the time that these students spent in school, they were actually doing tasks like cleaning, doing laundry, reading the Bible, of course, and doing menial tasks that the school operators didn't want to do. So sort of like household kinds of things, making sure that the school was in good order was actually left to the students to do. So because of all the different forms of abuse that these students and children faced, it's estimated that thousands of children died from malnutrition, physical abuse, poor living conditions, and disease. And we have a stat here that says that essentially your risk of dying in a residential school was equivalent to dying in World War II. So it really shows you like the kinds of conditions that these children were living in. So on the previous slide, I said that some of these children were sexually abused, and there were some babies that were born in the residential schools, but often those babies were born and died in the schools as well. So there were some very unfortunate, sad fates for these students. So I have here a bit of a summary of what the residential schools took away from the Aboriginal peoples. So you can see that there's a whole bunch of things that these individuals lost. I put at the top of the list parenting skills, because we'll be coming back to that a bit later too. Because these kids were forced and pulled away from their families, their parents weren't able to parent and learn how to parent. That sort of continues the cycle, which I'll talk about a bit later. But yeah, a lot of different things that they lost because of residential schools. So you might be thinking, residential schools happened a long time ago. Like, what's the big deal? Why does this still matter? But kind of what I always envisioned and saw as the reason why this still matters in Aboriginal culture is because of shared history. So in Aboriginal culture, shared history means that you're sharing experiences with people that have the same familial, generational, and cultural life as you. So in terms of residential schools and the other forms of oppression that Aboriginals face, they're actually sharing intergenerationally the memories, the anger, the shame, the confusion throughout their generations. So if your grandfather experienced this, you're like holding those memories, and you have those same experiences throughout time. And there's an Aboriginal writer here, Lyndon Hogan, who I thought really summed up what shared history is, because it's sometimes a difficult concept to wrap your mind around. So she eloquently wrote, "Walking, I am listening to a deeper way. Suddenly, all my ancestors are behind me. Be still, they say. Watch and listen. You are the result of the love of thousands. So here she's taking a positive spin on things. But this really sums up what shared history is. So you're taking with you the positive as well as the negative of what your ancestors have experienced. Okay? And then another way that can be helpful for you to understand why does this all still matter nowadays is this is a cycle that sort of highlights why the intergenerational trauma still matters. So it shows how current and future generations of Aboriginals will continue to bear the effects of the attempts to civilize and assimilate Aboriginals into mainstream society. So at the top right here, we have that children were removed from their homes, which we already know, and then their culture and their spirituality was disrupted. Then that led to the kids being punished and abused. And then they were sent back to their parents, but often their parents were taught these same unhealthy behaviors because they probably went to residential schools as well. So that cycle just keeps on continuing. And then later, many children were removed again from their homes and placed into foster care. And it was based on the premise that the parents weren't able to adequately provide and care for their children. But the irony of it is these parents were being punished for not having parenting skills, but it was often because they weren't given the opportunity to acquire parenting skills because their kids were forcibly taken away from them. So it's like they're just being punished over and over again for something that they had no choice in. So unfortunately, we see a lot of long-lasting effects as a result of these historical and contemporary issues, and also because of that shared history belief that we have. So Aboriginals still feel disconnected from their traditional land, culture, and ancestral languages. And then I have some statistics here where only about 2/3 of Aboriginal adults have completed high school compared to 87% of non-Aboriginals. We have the median income for Aboriginals being about 1/3 lower than non-Aboriginals. And then they're more at risk for being assaulted, more at risk for alcoholism, drug abuse. And a very scary statistic is the youth suicide rate among Aboriginals is about 6 times the national average, and it's 11 times that for Inuits. And one of the main factors is the increased social isolation for Inuits. But the youth suicide rate for Inuits is among one of the highest in the world. So it's definitely a big issue that needs to be focused on and try to remedy it. So you might be looking at all this information and thinking, like, yeah, it seems really interesting from a research point of view, but there's still a lot more information that we need to get on Aboriginals to figure out what are the actual solutions that we need to put into place. But then when you're thinking of research, you have to consider how can you be conducting research in an ethical manner, especially when it's with a population like Aboriginals who have been often in a disadvantaged position. So I wanted to talk next about ethics and how that applies to research. So there's this big document called the Tri-Council Policy Statement, and that outlines guidelines for ethical conduct for research involving humans. And then there's chapter 9 that specifically looks at ethical issues regarding Aboriginals. So in the past, when Aboriginal research has been conducted, it's often done by non-Aboriginal researchers. And unfortunately, historically, the research didn't reflect Aboriginal worldviews always, or the research didn't always benefit their communities. So you'd have a researcher coming in, getting data, and then just leaving, and not really benefiting and helping the community. And sometimes Aboriginals experience abuse and mistreatment from the research studies as well. So all of these negative situations that emerge from Aboriginal research has left many Aboriginals having some apprehension and mistrust regarding research. So we have put this policy statement in place to figure out how can we actually do Aboriginal research in an ethical manner that's benefiting Aboriginal communities. So the main sort of overarching principle is that we want to involve the Aboriginal community in the whole research process. So from the beginning with research design, getting Aboriginals to help us figure out what are the research questions that are even important to your community. What do you want to know that can help you in your community with the problems that you see? And then all the way to the end when we're sharing research results, we want them involved in helping us to figure out what's the best way to do that. And then because, as we have already talked about the fact that there's a lot of diversity among Aboriginal communities, context and community matters a lot. So we want to be able to tailor our research approach depending on the specific community that we're going to be involved in. So before I get into the ethical principles, does anybody have any general questions so far? Have I lost anybody? No? We're good? Okay. So there's 3 main ethical principles that apply to all human research, but I'm going to show you how it's applied mainly for Aboriginal communities. So the first principle is respect for persons. And specific to the Aboriginal community, what's unique about this is you would extend your ethical protection to the interrelationship between humans and the natural world. So thinking of the lands that you're involved in as well. So this includes also an obligation to past generations. So again, thinking about shared history. So there's an obligation to maintain and pass on to future generations knowledge and innovations developed in the present generation. So having that continuity of generations and making sure that everyone's benefiting. And then the second ethical principle is concern for welfare. So again, thinking of how does this work in the Aboriginal context, you want to consider collective welfare as a complement to individual welfare. So the community matters just as much as the individual. And you want to consider the well-being in the context of the physical, social, economic, and cultural environments, as well as the larger community. And with researchers that are looking at Aboriginal populations, you always want to make sure that you're enhancing the capacity to maintain their culture, language, and identities. So we don't want something else where they're losing those pieces that make them who they are. And we also want to make sure that their involvement in research supports their full participation and contribution to Canadian society. So they feel like they're actually contributing and being an active citizen by doing our research.
Hey Daniella, can I ask you a quick question
Yes.
at that point?
Yeah.
What might help these guys understand this a little better is, I know you've done some other research related to Aboriginal
Yes.
issues. Do you have an example you could share with them of where you've done that?
Yes.
Like another project you did where you could maybe share, unless you're going to go that way already?
I'll give a couple examples throughout. Maybe what I can do is I can go through this third ethical principle and I may give you an example of one of the other projects I worked on and try to sort of piece it together on the spot as to how I adhere to this stuff. Yeah, I can probably do that. And I will give you guys some examples throughout as well. So with the third ethical principle, it's justice. So in the past, researchers would sometimes devalue Aboriginals' traditional knowledge that they had and seen it as primitive or superstitious, or they failed to share data and the benefits that resulted from it. Or sometimes the data was misrepresented to stigmatize entire communities. So of course we want to be avoiding that. And there are some approaches like community engagement that I'll be talking about in a little bit that helps prevent these issues. So in terms of, okay, so one of the other studies that I did in terms of Aboriginal research is, I'm originally from Toronto, so back in Toronto I helped develop and then evaluate a mentorship program for first-year Aboriginal students. So as you saw, the education rates are really low for them, even for high school. So the chances of an Aboriginal student going to university is even slimmer. So once we get them in the university, we want to make sure that retention is high, that they're getting the support that they need. And I was at York University, so it's one of the largest universities in Ontario. So we wanted to think, okay, we have a huge Aboriginal population here. We want to make sure that we're supporting them well here. So we ended up pairing the first year Aboriginal students with upper year Aboriginal mentors to help them figure out, make sure they're getting academic support as well as emotional, cultural support, everything that they needed. In terms of like respect for persons, so we did the basics in terms of informed consent. So just like how you guys got those consent forms today, we made sure that they were aware of their rights, making sure that we're not stripping away any rights that they have. And we did extend the ethical protection in a way to the natural world. There were times where we would have activities on Aboriginal grounds, and we would acknowledge like what band or nation it was affiliated with. And that was probably the extent of us doing that. And then in terms of like passing it on to future generations, we did publish and disseminate this information that we had to help future university Aboriginal students figure out what worked and didn't work in terms of what they need as a university student. And then concern for welfare. I'm trying to think how we did that. So we did make sure that we maintained their culture and identity, and I think that's a key part of concern for welfare when we're thinking of Aboriginals. So we made sure that not only were these students getting like academic support and if they needed things like tutoring, but we also made sure that we included like cultural activities in the mentorship program. Made sure they had a place that they can actually share cultural and spiritual practices in a safe community, because they might not have had that otherwise. So making sure that's happening, especially as so many of the university students that we see are urban Aboriginals. So they're living in the cities, they've been urbanized, and they might actually be very far removed from their culture. They're not living on reserves, so they might not have that strong connection to their culture, and having it at the university was really useful for them. And then in terms of justice, having that power imbalance, obviously we made sure not to do that. And one thing that we really were proud of is we were able to hire on some Aboriginal research assistants to help us with the program. And you'll see that's an example of some of the things that other individuals will do as well. So we're making sure that we're not acting like, oh, we're the researchers, we're coming in, we know more than you, we're gonna get this data and information from you. We wanted to make sure that we were all on the same level and that we can actually seek input from the Aboriginal participants and let them shape the process, just as I was mentioning earlier. Okay? So we talked about having the community involved, and there is actually a term called community engagement that really sums that up. So it's that collaboration between the researcher and the communities. And it could be something as simple as getting a review or approval from an Aboriginal leader to do research in a community. Or it might be more involved as getting their input on research design or research questions. When you get to the point where you have data and results, maybe hosting an information session to the community to give back and to show them what data we have and how that can benefit their community. And then, again, because each community is so different, the degree of collaboration may vary. So one community might want to get really, really involved, and other ones might think, well, I'm just going to let you do it, but I don't really want to get involved. So you have our permission, but we don't really care what you do. Like, you're free to do whatever you want. So it really varies. And also the nature of the research matters. So sometimes people will be doing archival studies where you're looking at past data, and that's often in books or on computer files, that kind of thing. So you're not actually engaging with human beings really then. So in that sense, you wouldn't really have much collaboration, if any, sometimes. So it does depend on the kind of research you're doing. So another related term, a couple of them, there's participatory research, and then there's community-centered research. And they all kind of jive together and contribute to that same overall feeling that we're trying to bring into Aboriginal research. So with community-centered research, it means that you're conducting research by, for, and with the community. So it's that idea of having a research assistant of Aboriginal descent. So having them really entrenched and involved in what we're doing. And then participatory research means that you're having sort of a reciprocal learning process. So we're learning from the participants, that's the whole point of doing the research, but then we're also providing an opportunity for them to learn from us as well. So often whenever researchers will do Aboriginal research, they will offer the communities a chance to learn about research methods or ethical review so that the communities can then increase their ability to do their own research. So they become a bit more self-sufficient, and then that helps them redirect what they can do and really have a good control on what kind of research is being done for them. And then there's capacity building. which again is the same idea of making sure that the participants are collaborating and that you're offering the skills back to the community. So making sure that they have those kinds of skills like project management, knowing how to create a research study. And that's about being really transparent about the process so that they know what they can do if they wanted to get involved in research. Okay, so now we've talked about the ethics and those basic principles regarding Aboriginal research, but I wanted to switch gears a little bit and look at one particular sector of research with regards to the justice system, which of course relates well to this class. So in terms of Aboriginals and the justice system, as you can see from this list, Aboriginals are overrepresented in pretty much all aspects of the justice system. And then an interesting statistic is Aboriginals, I think earlier I said they make about 4% of the overall Canadian population, but in terms of the adults, they make about 3% of the Canadian population. But, so even though it's a small percentage, they actually end up making about 20% of admissions to custody and probation. So a huge difference there. And then a bit of an older statistic from 1996 to 2004, when the federal adult incarceration rates were all declining by about 12–13%, it actually increased overall among Aboriginals by about 20%, and it increased even more among Aboriginal women by 74%. So there's a lot of discrepancy here. We're seeing that Aboriginals are making up a small amount of the population generally, but then they're very overrepresented in the justice system. And when we see adult incarceration rates going down among the general population, that's not the case for Aboriginals. So we got to figure out like, what's going on here. So this is just a short list of some of the contributing factors. This is definitely not inclusive. There's a lot more that's going on. But there, of course, is systematic discrimination. So just all that stuff that happened historically for Aboriginals, there's individuals that still hold that discriminatory worldview amongst Aboriginals. So that's a factor, as well as social and economic deprivation. So we saw issues like how they have less educational opportunities, less income. So there's that deprivation in that sense. Intergenerational problems due to assimilation. So there's a cycle of violence that will often happen intergenerationally. And then there's other issues like family breakdown, substance abuse, and social exclusion. That's all contributing. So it's sort of just a big whirlwind of different factors that could be influencing these individuals. So we see this is kind of the cause, this is what's making this is like the first half of the equation. But then it's like, well, we know that this is some of the reasons that this is happening, but how can we try to curb this overrepresentation of Aboriginals in the justice system? So I wanted to point out just a few that Canada has put into place. So there are developing stronger relations between the police community and the Aboriginal community. There's restorative justice, which I know is a theme and a topic that will be covered in this class. Another potential solution would be to have more culturally appropriate community-based interventions. So currently what's in place is there are some alternative sentencing measures, things like family mediation or civil mediation, offender reintegration, as well as victim support. So it's trying to sort of just diversify what's available. And then having the right to practice cultural ceremonies in prisons. So currently there are some prisons run by Corrections Services Canada that has healing lodges. So making sure that sort of branches out and more facilities are offering those kinds of ceremonies. And then having more culturally appropriate court systems as well. And there is the Aboriginal Court Worker Program. And this helps Aboriginals better understand their rights and options, and it also helps justice officials better understand and meet the needs of Aboriginals. So a two-way street there. And then there's 405 Aboriginal communities with dedicated police services that has employed over 1,200 Aboriginal police officers. So that's definitely a step in the right direction. Okay, any questions so far? No? I still got you guys all good? Okay, so I wanted to touch on a relevant case, and it's Ewart versus Canada. And this highlights how sometimes the research tools and questionnaires that we use might not be equivalent for use with Aboriginals. So last fall, the federal court, they released a decision saying that there was an action against Correctional Services Canada for an unjustified violation of the plaintiff's Section 7, as it's under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it's their right to life, liberty, and security. I'll go into that in a little more detail later. So the person at the center of this case, he was a 53-year-old Métis prisoner. His name is Jeffrey Ewart, and he grew up in Surrey, so it's actually really close to where we are now. He was serving 2 life sentences for second-degree murder as well as attempted murder. And then he was also sentenced to 15 months of imprisonment to be served concurrently for an escape from a lawful custody conviction. So of the time that he spent in jail, he spent about 30 years in federal correctional facilities, and about half of that time was in high security facilities. The other half was in medium security. So this guy was definitely seen as a high risk. So Ewart alleged that the questionnaire, so just the same kinds of things that you're filling out, but on different topics. So the questionnaires that were used by correctional services, he felt wasn't culturally appropriate for Aboriginal prisoners. And he also argued that the tests had an adverse impact on him. And I'll explain what he meant about that in a little bit. So during his custody, he was given 5 psychological assessment tools, so questionnaires. And these were used to test psychopathy, as well as his risk of reoffending in violent or sexual crimes. So the court found that just generally, the results of these tests will often influence individual security ratings. So if an inmate was considered to be high risk, low risk, or medium risk, whether inmates were allowed temporary absences from prison, and also their assessment of parole. So these tests would carry a lot of weight when they were used in correctional facilities. So the court found that with the test results that Ewart had, they labeled him as an undue risk to society. And he alleged that the test results would render him unlikely to be granted parole because he was such a high risk. So he said that he consistently opted out of parole hearings because of these scores and results that he got from his tests. He just thought he didn't have a chance, so he might as well not apply for parole. So in this case, when I went to court, the plaintiff, so Ewart had a witness, Dr. Stephen Hart, who's a professor at SFU, and he provided evidence to say that he felt that these tests that were administered could actually be susceptible to cultural bias. And he said that the scores of the assessment tests he wouldn't actually use among Aboriginal inmates because of those cultural differences that are inherent between Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals. And the court overall found that his evidence was persuasive, objective, and balanced. Now the defendant's witness was Dr. Marnie Rice, and she supported her views by referencing a study that had very few Aboriginals in it. And then she also failed to disclose that she was the authors of 2 of the tests, which is a bit of a conflict of interest. So the court was a bit wary of her evidence because of these issues. So the federal court ended up relying much more heavily on Dr. Hart's research and evidence, and pretty much disregarding what Dr. Rice was saying. So they determined that Ewart was successful in proving that his tests were unreliable because of possible cultural bias, but we still don't really know, are these tests actually biased for Aboriginals? We still don't really know that for sure. And then the court also said that the test results negatively impacted Ewart because it increased his security classification and decreased his desire to apply for parole. Now, I did mention the Charter of Human Rights, and he was saying that it was violated. So Ewart said that he was deprived of his liberty because the test results made parole practically unattainable, in his opinion. And also his security of person was infringed because he was labeled as a risk to society and psychopathic based on his test results. So the court found that these tests went beyond what was their intended objective, which was just to have them identified as a threat to public security. But then we're seeing all these other things that are going on and influencing you that the tests weren't actually intended to do. But this breach couldn't be justified. The court declared their intent to prevent Correction Services Canada from using the tests on Aboriginal inmates until further research tests were conducted. So we have to see, like, are these tests actually reliable with Aboriginals before we can continue using it? And that's kind of where we're at now. And they also ordered that in this particular case, if you were, that Correctional Services Canada stop using testing for him as well. So this case, they said that the continued use was a breach. Yeah, I did mention that. So this case, it shows that there's a lack of consensus on whether risk assessment tools are biased for Aboriginals or not. So more research needs to be done before we can really make a clear-cut decision on this, one way or the other. So this is a negative kind of case, and we see there's a lot of, all these tests that he was given, it focused a lot on risk factors like psychopathy. But I want you to consider to yourselves for a second, if you're just considering risk factors of an individual, is it really giving you a complete picture of a person? So for instance, if you knew, okay, they have psychopathic tendencies, is that really all you need to know about the person? Or should we sort of dig deeper, find out sort of more of the full picture of the person? And I wanted to turn to positive psychology next, because they would say looking at risk factors is just not the full story at all. So positive psychology, it was pioneered by these two happy, smiling researchers. I can never know how to pronounce the second guy's name, so I'm not going to try. But it's fitting that they're smiling on this slide, because positive psychology is all about looking on the brighter side of things. So a bit of a mini history lesson. Before World War II, psychology had three distinct missions. So it was to cure mental illness, make people feel more productive and fulfilled, and identifying and nurturing high talent. So you see that there's some positive initiatives here. But then once World War II hit, and there was this big influx of war veterans, and that meant that there was increased need to treat mental illness, so things like post-traumatic stress disorder. And then there was also increased funding to focus on mental illness. So that's when psychology sort of switched gears and focused more on the negative and sort of let the positives fall to the wayside. So psychology was largely focused on treating mental illness within the disease framework. So you're repairing damage. So it was the whole idea that you have a damaged brain, damaged habits, damaged drives, childhoods. Everything about you is damaged and negative. And how can we fix that? So it really neglected the fulfilled individual and the thriving community. So the goal of positive psychology is to shift from not just fixing what is broken, but also nurturing what is best in people. So with positive psychology, it mainly focuses on protective factors instead of risk factors. So a protective factor is a human strength that allows individuals to grow and flourish, and it acts as a buffer against mental illness. Whereas a risk factor puts people at risk for negative outcomes, so something like psychopathy. So an example to show you how protective factors weigh against risk factors. So let's say you were researching the factors that make teenagers prone to depression. So a positive psychology researcher would investigate what factors prevent depression. So maybe things like building optimism in the teenagers. Whereas in a regular psychology context, if you're just looking at risk factors, you might look at things like if they're self-harming, if they have anxiety, other negative things that are occurring that put them at risk. So because protective factors is looking at how we can sort of curb what's happening or what is bound to happen, that means that prevention is a key goal of positive psychology. So we're trying to stop negative things from happening by focusing on the positive traits that individuals hold. So here on this slide, I just have a quick sampling of different topics that positive psychologists would be researching. So you can see it's a lot more on the cheerier side of things, which is nice. About halfway through my research career, I switched to positive psychology, and it was like a relief. I was like, okay, I'm not talking about negative things anymore, except for like this lecture. Okay, so we have different topics here that are involved in positive psychology. And the last topic I wanted to talk to you guys about today is an example of a culturally sensitive measure that is rooted in positive psychology theory. And that's the My Life Balance Wheel, which was that last long questionnaire that you guys were filling out. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so the theory that inspired the My Life Balance Wheel is the idea that in order to meet the needs of Aboriginal youth, but also youth in general, you need to have a holistic approach to them. So seeing the individual as a whole person. And this, of course, echoes positive psychology really well. So we're not just looking at the negative things that a person brings to the table, but also the positivity that they're bringing. So it's designed to be a culturally relevant measure for Aboriginal populations in particular. But then, as I mentioned, with this current study that we're doing, we're looking at non-Aboriginals as well. So it was created by Dr. Clark, who is a psychologist in youth forensics, and Dr. Williams. So this measure has two goals: to look at that holistic approach to an individual, as well as setting goals towards achieving life balance. So you hear a lot of positivity coming out just in the way that we're describing the measure. And then in terms of how we try to be ethical when we were conducting this research, keep in mind that it was originally for an Aboriginal population. We engaged the community by consulting with elders as well as collaborators at a nationally accredited program for Aboriginals that treats trauma and substance abuse. So we definitely tried to get in at the ground and engage with the community, get their feedback on what this measure was like. So before I show you what the My Life Balance Wheel looks like, I wanted to show you the medicine wheel first, because our measure is closely aligned with the medicine wheel. So the medicine wheel has 4 different dimensions of health. So it's not just looking at physical health, which we often think of first, but it also looks at mental health, spiritual health, and emotional health. So again, that holistic approach, looking at everything that the person has. And the premise behind the medicine wheel is if you focus on or become stuck in one of these 4 quadrants, then you lack wholeness in all of the aspects. So in order to stay healthy, you want to achieve a balance and wholeness among the 4 quadrants. Okay, so you guys filled out the questionnaire version of the My Life Balance Wheel, but in the clinical settings, the clinicians will often get participants to actually plot their results on an actual wheel. And this is the My Life Balance Wheel. Just due to time, we didn't get you guys to do that piece today. So with the questions that you answered, you end up plotting the points along these different spokes. So participants would be asked to rate themselves according to the wheel configuration on various aspects of well-being. And their ratings are usually completed directly on this wheel with the aid of the questionnaire that you completed. So similar to the medicine wheel, there's 4 aspects to the My Life Balance Wheel: body, mind, feelings, and spirituality. And then each of those categories are broken up into 2 categories. So you can see for like body and physical, it's broken up into health and self-care. And then each of those categories are broken up into 3 subcategories. So we're really looking at all the nitty-gritty that makes up a person. And then each of these categories has spokes that are leading to the middle of the wheel. And individuals are asked to rate their level of wellness on each category by indicating usually a stone on each path. So when you're doing it in a clinical setting, you'll have a bunch of stones, and they're actually placing it. And that reflects how the traditional medicine wheels were made, by placing rocks in sacred and specific formations. So it's, again, bringing in that Aboriginal culture. So we're not just getting them to do it with paper and pencil usually. And then the solid circle right in the middle represents the value of seeking consolidation of internal self-awareness when assessing life balance. So here you can see an example of a filled out My Life Balance Wheel. So healthier ratings are going to be closer to the outside of the wheel. If it's unhealthy or imbalanced, it's going to be further to the inside. So what a participant would end up doing is they would connect all the marks or the stones sometimes with lines to create a bit of a spider's web configuration. And then this would have a really good visual representation of areas that are in balance as well as out of balance. So it's like strengths and weaknesses, which is again like positive psychology. So with this example of this client, compared to their other categories, they would be experiencing some imbalance on wellness, so that's closer to the circle, so they're more imbalanced. Some imbalance on healing, land in nature, and wholeness. So then when they see that there's some of these issues that are out of balance, then that would allow the client to set goals for how they can seek more balance in those areas. And then often in clinical settings, we would get participants to fill out this My Life Balance Wheel numerous times so they can sort of track the progress over time and see how their balance is fluctuating over time. So just to conclude, I really wanted to drive home the point that this measure is really trying to mirror Aboriginal culture. So it's a promising example of an assessment tool that is culturally sensitive, specifically to Aboriginals, by mirroring the traditional balance wheel. So here I've shaded in the different colors from the medicine wheel, so you can really see that overlap between the two wheels. So yeah, this is definitely one step in the right direction for creating more applicable research to the Aboriginal community. Yes, and that's it. And if you guys have any questions, I'll take them now. Yeah?
And what I was going to ask was when you were talking about protective factors versus risk factors.
Yeah.
So would is something you were saying to the criminal justice system is somebody applying for parole a lot of the time when they don't get it, they're like labeled with too many risk factors?
Yes.
Is that saying that if somebody was labeled with a lot of protective factors, and even though they had some risk factors, they should be allowed parole or like more considered for it?
Like you want to consider those protective factors, right? So often when they are being assessed for parole, it's using those risk assessments that you were saying isn't really that great of an idea, especially for certain cultural groups. So often they'll be looking at risk factors only, seeing if you're a psychopath, if you have any other mental illnesses, other issues like that, and really just looking at the negative. So the concept behind positive psychology is, yes, these criminals might have negative factors that put them at risk and that would make parole not a good idea, but we also want to look at what protective factors they have. So let's say they come from a stable family environment and they're going to be returning to that environment, and that could be a source of support for them. That would be a protective factor. If they have an educational background that makes them more likely to get a good job when they come out of jail, that would be a protective factor. So things like that would actually allow them to be reintegrated into society successfully, would help sort of offset some of those risk factors and get that full picture.
So protective factors are almost like opportunities that they have.
Exactly. Yeah, opportunities is a really good way of putting it. Yeah. Any other questions? No?